Okay, what is up there, YouTube? This is the G-Man Time, and today I have a video on top 5 rare Romanian tanks and armored fighting vehicles that were badly needed during the Second World War. During World War II, Romania, being one of the 4 largest Axis powers, did lack a large number of tanks and armored fighting vehicles when compared to the top 3 Axis powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan. This is largely due to the fact that Romania did not have a large armored vehicle manufacturing base like the Germans, the Italians, and the Japanese had. In fact, the smaller Axis allied state of Hungary actually had better tank manufacturing and armored fighting vehicle manufacturing facilities than Romania did, as Hungary was one of the few European Axis powers to produce some of their own tanks and armored cars during the Second World War. There were some Romanian factories that did try to produce armored fighting vehicles for the army. For example, the Romanian manufacturer militara actually did manufacture copies of the French UE artillery tankette, which was a standard artillery tankette and artillery tractor used by the French army, and Romania purchased the license to manufacture this vehicle in Romania in 1939. Romania, out of all of the European Axis powers, got shafted really badly when it came to Germany. Now, Romania did try to purchase more German tanks during the war, but the problem was Romania was largely broke when it came to having money to purchase new weapons and vehicles. As a result, they mostly relied on captured Soviet tanks or tanks that were later given to them, confiscated, or taken from army units that fled to Romania from collapsing European countries like Czechoslovakia and later Poland. So let's go over some of the badly needed Romanian tanks of World War II. Now, when Romania entered World War II, they only had 126 light tanks. These were the Czech-made Panzer 35T, 75 French-made Renault R35 light cavalry tanks. These were purchased from France, and some of these came from Poland, and they also had 35 R1 tankettes. These tankettes were copies of the Czechoslovakian AH-4, and they also had 75 severely outdated French-made Renault FT-17s. These were old World War I vintage FT-17s that were purchased at the end of World War I or in the 1920s by the Romanian army. But Romania did have access to a large number of Czech-designed vehicles. Since the mid to late 1930s, Romania had been purchasing a lot of Czechoslovakian armored fighting vehicle designs, and in fact they actually did purchase a license to manufacture some of these vehicles in Romania, but the problem being they didn't have enough manufacturing facilities to actually produce any of these vehicles in large numbers. And that brings us to the first vehicle on the list, the Czechoslovakian/Romanian R1 tankette from 1936. The R1 was a Romanian copy of the Czech AH-4. The AH-4 was a Czech infantry support tankette designed in 1935, and in 1936, Romania got the license to manufacture the AH-6 in Romania under the name R1. The main armament of this tankette was one 7.92mm ZB-35 or ZB-37 heavy machine gun, and a secondary armament of one 7.92mm ZB-26 or ZB-30 light machine gun. The armor thickness was 6 to 12 millimeters, and the vehicle had a speed of 45 kilometers per hour or 28 miles per hour, and it had a crew of 2. In 1936, Romania ordered some 36 of these tankettes from Czechoslovakia, and they also purchased a license to manufacture the tankette. But only one Romanian copy was ever made, and as a result, they were not able to purchase any more, as Czechoslovakia was later annexed by Germany in March of 1939. Romania did try to set up factories to produce the AH-4 in Romania, but they simply didn't have enough time, and they didn't have enough resources. In 1940, just before the fall of France, Romania also purchased some more of the French-made R-35 light cavalry tank, and they also tried to get resources to build their own factories to manufacture both the R-35 and the Czechoslovakian AH-4. But France later fell to Germany in the middle of 1940. As a result, the Romanians never got the resources needed from France to set up new factories in order to produce both the French R-35 and the Czechoslovakian AH-4. As a result, only a mere 36 of these tankets would serve in the Romanian army during the Second World War. If Romania did manage to get the resources to build factories for both the AH-4 and the French R-35, they could have mass-produced these tankets in Romania, along with the French light cavalry tank, the R-35. The R-1, as it's known in Romania, could have been the standard issued infantry support light infantry support vehicle for Romanian ground troops. For example, all of the other Axis powers had at least one tank, light tank, or tankette as standard issued for their armed forces. For the Germans, they had the Panzer I and Panzer II. For the Italians, they had the L333 series of tankettes, and they also had the L6 series of light tanks. Even the Japanese had several tankettes and light tanks in their service, but Romania was largely stuck using the old Renault FT-17s and a few of the Czech-made Panzer 35Ts. And if the Romanians had gotten the resources to build larger factories, they could have mass-produced the AH-4 in large numbers. Ultimately, the Romanians would fail in that quest, largely due to their own German allies. If Germany hadn't invaded France in 1940, then the Romanians could have gotten more resources and could have gotten the equipment from France to manufacture both the French R-35 and this tankette, the AH-4. Another area that Romania lacked in when it came to armored fighting vehicles in World War II was a standard infantry armored car or armored truck. The Germans, the Italians, and even the Hungarians had a standard issued medium or heavy armored car for infantry support. But in the 1930s, Romania did purchase several experimental or limited production Czech-made armored trucks that could have been manufactured in Romania even without the heavy factories, because Romania did have some factories for developing trucks at least. And this armored truck was the Czech-made CKD Praga NT SPE 34 and model 1937. Now, these were actually two variations of the same armored truck, and these were actually produced in small numbers in Czechoslovakia for export to Romania between 1934 and 1937. The main armament of this vehicle were two 7.92mm machine guns. The armor thickness was 4 to 8 millimeters. The vehicle had a speed of 40 to 50 kilometers per hour or 25 to 35 miles per hour, and the vehicle had a crew of 3 to 4. In total, Romania only purchased about 7 to 12 of these vehicles between 1934 and 1937, and these were largely used by the Romanian military police, also known as the Gendarme, or the Gendarme. But Romania did have some factories that were already producing trucks for the Romanian military. For example, in 1937, Romania actually got the rights to manufacture the American-made Marmon Harrington heavy supply truck in Romania, in which some 450 of those were produced at the very start of World War II. So Romania did have the ability to produce trucks, and they could produce some armored fighting vehicles like the aforementioned Malaxa artillery tractor, which was a copy of the French UE artillery tractor or tankette. So the Romanians could have manufactured this easy to mass produce armored truck as a standard issued infantry truck for the Romanian army, as the Romanian army had very few armored cars. Most of the armored cars they did have came from Germany and later Italy. The Romanians were so desperate for armored cars that they even begged the Italians for armored cars, but Italy could only send a mere 8 of their Auto Blenda 41, which was an Italian heavy armored car made in 1940-1941. And those 8 vehicles were the only heavy armored cars that the Romanians had. Most of the other armored cars were German-made medium and light armored cars. But if the Romanians had decided to mass-produce this Praga NT model 1934 and model 1937 armored truck, simple armored truck, they could have had a standard issued heavy armored truck or medium armored truck for the Romanian infantry during the fighting on the Eastern Front in World War II. But only a mere 7 to 12 vehicles were built, and they were mostly used as guard vehicles or patrol vehicles in the city of Bucharest for the duration of World War II. Literally wasted potential. And now we come to one of the rare tanks that Romania could have adopted in World War II, at least as a light tank destroyer or light self-propelled gun. And this is the Marsal tank or Marsal light tank destroyer M00 from 1942. Now, this was the first version of the Romanian experimental self-propelled gun tank destroyer that was developed between 1942 and 1944, and Marsal was one of the most advanced vehicles developed by Romania during the early to middle part of World War II. It was actually the influence for the German Hatzer series of light tank destroyers that were made by converting existing Panzer III-ATs into light self-propelled guns. The first version of the Marsal tank destroyer should have been taken seriously, and it should have been mass-produced in 1943. Now, the Model M00 had a main armament of one 122mm M30 howitzer, which was a copy or a captured version of the Soviet M30 howitzer. Its secondary armament was one 7.92mm ZB-53 heavy machine gun. Its armor thickness was pretty thin, only 10 to 20 millimeters, but it was sloped armor, so it really had the effect of having 60 millimeters of armor. But it is sloped armor, so the chances of a penetration hit was pretty rare. The speed was 45 kilometers per hour, or 27.9 miles per hour, and the vehicle had a crew of 2. Only about 7 of these prototypes were built, but only one of the M00 were built. 7 Marsal prototypes were built in total, and these light tank destroyers were based on the Soviet T-60 light tank chassis. A Romanian company called Rodefer was planning on manufacturing these prototype light tank destroyers in 1943-1944, but it took way too long to develop this light tank destroyer. The first prototype was finished in January of 1943. So if the Romanians had taken the Marsal M00 version, or at least the M01 version seriously, they could have begun production in 1943, which would have given them enough time to make enough of these to help stall or repel the Soviet advance towards the Romanian border. But ultimately, the Romanians didn't take the first 2 variants seriously and continued working on the Marsal project all the way up until almost the middle of 1944. By the middle of 1944, they were on their 5th prototype, the M05, which had a 75mm anti-tank gun that was manufactured in Romania by the Romanian company known as Uzina Rosita. Ultimately, by the time these vehicles entered production, the Romanian government was later overthrown in a coup in late 1944, and later on the Soviets would enter Romania, and Romania would switch sides, thus ending any potential use of the Marsal tank destroyers. All of the tank destroyers that were under construction were later confiscated by the Soviets and were destroyed at the end of the war. So this vehicle here was Romania's attempt at manufacturing a tank destroyer that was pretty much the Romanian equivalent of the German Hatzer light tank destroyer. Literally wasted potential. But that is not even the largest wasted potential when it came to Romanian tanks that were badly needed in World War II, or at least tank concepts that Romania had access to that could have been manufactured in Romania and could have helped the Romanians stop the Soviet advance towards their own border, and the Romanians could have prevented the rise of, communism in Romania. And the next tank on the list is another great example of a wasted potential for the Romanian army. The next tank on the list that could have been useful and was badly needed in World War II by the Romanians was the R3 tancuri. The R3 was a prototype medium tank developed between 1937 and 1939. It was a copy of the Czech-made Skoda S2C, also known as the T21. The T21 was a Czech-made experimental medium tank developed between 1937 and 1939. In 1939, Skoda would send one prototype to Romania along with several other experimental armored fighting vehicles. And these vehicles were actually tested by the Romanians. And the Romanians actually liked this Skoda T21, also known as the S2C. The main armament was one 47mm Skoda A9 VZ38 main gun, which had an armor penetration of 24 to 115 millimeters at ranges of 100 to 1,500 yards. The secondary armament was two 7.92mm machine guns. The armor thickness was just 30 millimeters, which was good in 1939, but should have been upgraded during the Second World War. Speed was 50 kilometers per hour or 31 miles per hour, and the vehicle had a crew of 4. Now, only 2 or 3 prototypes were built in Czechoslovakia, and only one was tested in Romania between 1939 and 1940. Now, the Romanians liked this vehicle so much that they ordered about 216 from Czechoslovakia. But Germany would go on to annex Czechoslovakia in 1939 also. As a result, the Germans would later cancel the Romanian order. Later on, Romania tried to bargain the Germans for the 116 production models of the T21, but the Germans didn't allow them to get the tanks because they wanted Romania to join the Axis powers. Keep in mind, Romania was still a neutral nation in 1939-1940. So Romania did eventually join the Axis powers that same year. And in early 1941, Romania ordered another 287 tanks from German-occupied Czechoslovakia. Again, the Germans did not send or manufacture any of these tanks. Instead, they only sent about 26 to 30 old, worn-out Panzer III light tanks. Romania did try to set up facilities to manufacture the tank themselves, but they had made a very flawed decision on sending the prototype T21 tank back to Czechoslovakia, which was still under German control at this time. And the Germans did not send them the prototype back. So without the prototype, the Romanians simply couldn't manufacture the tank because they didn't have the blueprints, and they gave back the original prototype of the T21 medium tank. So Romania was prepared to manufacture the T21 under the name R3, but the tank had already been sent back to Czechoslovakia, which was under Germany's control, and Germany did not want to give Romania the prototype of the T21 back, and as a result, the Romanians would scrap the R3 medium tank project in the middle of 1941. Now, if the Romanians had kept the rare prototype that the Czechs had given them, they could have reverse engineered it, similarly to what the Germans, the Italians, the Hungarians, and the Japanese were doing during the Second World War when they came across captured vehicles or experimental vehicles that were given to them in the years before or during World War II. But since Romania gave back the T21 prototype, they never had a chance to do this, and the R3 medium tank never came into fruition as a standard issued medium tank in the Romanian army, and it was badly needed. That 47mm high powered Czech-made Skoda gun, the Skoda A9 could penetrate between 24 and 115 millimeters of armor, meaning it could defeat pretty much most of the Soviet light and medium tanks, including the KV-1 series of medium tanks and even the later war T-34 medium tanks being produced by the Soviet Union. And if Romania had gotten its original order of 216 tanks in 1939-1940, they would have already had a standard issued medium tank by the time they entered the war in 1941. So the R3/ the Skoda S2C/T21 was literally one of the biggest wasted potentials and biggest wasted opportunities for the Romanian army before they entered World War II and during the early part of World War II, where this tank would have been the most useful. Imagine how the Romanians would have done on the Eastern Front if they had a medium tank that could take out just about any Soviet medium tank at the start of World War II. The Axis powers might not have lost the Battle of Stalingrad. One of the reasons why the Axis powers lost the Battle of Stalingrad is because both the Romanians, the Hungarian, and the Italian lines could not hold their defensive positions because they were lacking in tanks, or in the case of the Italians, the tanks they had were seriously outdated when compared to the Soviet tanks. But the Romanians could have had a medium tank that could have had the stopping power to take out most of the Soviet tanks during that battle. And ultimately, that never happened, mostly due to Romania's own ally, Germany. Germany rebuffed Romania twice when they tried to get the tank manufactured in Czechoslovakia for the Romanian army, and they also did not give Romania back the original T21 prototype, which they needed in order to reverse engineer this vehicle for production in Romania. So literally, the R3 was the second largest wasted potential for the Romanian army in World War II. But the Romanian and Czech R3/T21 wasn't the largest wasted potential or wasted opportunity for the Romanians in the years before and during World War II. The biggest wasted opportunity came from another experimental Czech medium tank that was presented to Romania and was tested in Romania in the years before and during the first year of World War II, and that is the Czech-made VAH, also known as the ST Model 1939. And this here was an experimental Czechoslovakian-made medium tank that was also developed between 1937 and 1939. It could have served as the standard tank for both the Czechoslovakian army and also the Romanian army. The main armament was one 47mm Skoda A11 gun, which could penetrate between 35 and 115 millimeters of armor at ranges of 100 to 1,500 yards, and it also had two 7.92 millimeter machine guns, an armor thickness of 12 to 32 millimeters, and a speed of 43.5 kilometers per hour, or 27 miles per hour, and it had a crew of 4. Only 2 prototypes were built in Czechoslovakia, and one of these prototypes were sent to Romania in 1939-1940, and was tested by Romania in the year 1939-1940. Between those 2 years, the Romanians liked this tank just like they liked the Czechoslovakian Skoda T21 medium tank. But again, the Romanians made the same, dumb mistake. When Germany annexed Czechoslovakia in March 1939, the Romanians should have kept the tank in their inventory so they could reverse engineer it, so they could copy it and manufacture it in their own territory. But the Romanians were being too generous, and they gave back the experimental ST Model 1939 medium tank to what was now German-occupied Czechoslovakia. But unlike the T21, the Romanians made an even dumber decision. They rejected the VAH/ST-1939 tank in favor of the T21. But again, the Romanians wasted a huge opportunity to manufacture a more advanced tank. Now keep in mind, the VAH/ST-VZ39 was an upgrade, or was considered an upgrade by the Czechs, to the T21 and later the T22. The T22 was later manufactured by Hungary as the Tancuri 1 medium tank. Now, Romania could have manufactured the V8H, and the ST39 in Romania, but ultimately they didn't do this, as they sent the only prototype that the Czechs gave them back to Czechoslovakia, which was now under Germany's control. And just like the T21, the Germans were not going to give them this experimental medium tank to manufacture. In fact, the Germans would test the V8H in Germany and would later comment that this tank was equivalent to the German Panzer III medium tank. Ultimately, these two prototypes would survive World War II and were later scrapped by the post-war Czechoslovakian state, which was now under Soviet control. But just imagine what could have happened if Romania had just held on to the prototype themselves. They should have learned when it came to the T21 that when you send tanks back to occupied Czechoslovakia, it's not coming back. The Germans are not going to give it to you. They're just going to give you some old Panzer 35Ts, which are light tanks, and are not the tanks you needed on the Eastern Front if you were the Romanian army in World War II. You needed a medium tank. Romania was the only Axis power in World War II to not have a standard-issued production medium tank. Every other Axis power had a medium tank. The Germans had the Panzer III and IV. The Italians had the Carro Armato M1340 and M1441. The Japanese had the Type 97. And even the Hungarians had the Hungarian Tancuri 1 and Tancuri 2 and 3 series of medium tanks. But Romania did not have a medium tank, and they had two chances to manufacture a medium tank in their own country. They were given two very good advanced prototype medium tanks from Czechoslovakia, the T21 and the V8H, also known as the ST39, but they gave them back, trying to be nice and generous, and at the end of the day, it cost Romania big time. They would not have a standard issued medium tank for World War II, and as a result, Romania was constantly beaten back by the Soviets, who had tens of thousands of medium tanks, like the Soviet T-34 and the KV-1 series of tanks. And as a result, the Romanians got pushed all the way back to their borders. They got scared, overthrew their own leader, and accepted the Soviet takeover of their country. And as a result, Romania was later plunged into 40 years of darkness as a puppet state of the Soviet Union. And fast forward to today, the 2020s, the 21st century, Romania is still suffering because of that. And it all became from the fact that Romania sent back two of the most advanced Czech tanks, or Czech medium tanks, that was given to them by the Czechoslovakians in the late 1930s. So much wasted potential when it comes to the tanks on this list. At the end of the day, Romania did not take any of these tanks seriously, and even the ones they did attempt to manufacture, like the AH-4, was only produced in some very small numbers. And as a result, Romania would go on to lose World War II on the Eastern Front. But realistically speaking, even if they did manufacture these tanks in large numbers, it wasn't just Romania who had to hold the line. It was also the Germans, the Hungarians, and even their puppet states of Latvia, Estonia, Croatia, and a few other areas that had to hold their lines too. Ultimately, they all would fall, and they all would suffer the long-term ramifications of losing World War II. What do you all think of these 5 rare vehicles that Romania needed in World War II? Which of these are your favorite? If I had to choose, it would be either the T21 or maybe the V8H. But what are your opinions? Please tell me in the comments section below. And until next time, this was J-Man Time, signing off.